In today's session, we're going to be talking about firewalls, right? All the different types of firewalls, the evolution of firewalls, where it all started from, where we are today with firewalls, and where we're going with firewalls, right? So let's start off with our first type of firewall, right? It's the actual traditional type of classic firewall, right? So these firewalls typically existed in the data center. We're looking at several decades ago, right? They were typically called the five tuple firewalls, right? So because they're inspecting five tuples of a frame. So that's usually the source and destination IP addresses, the source and destination port numbers, and the protocols, right? So that's really those types of firewalls there. It was doing stateful inspection. So when a packet leaves the firewall, it gets inspected. The return packet of that same connection matches the stateful entry in the actual table, and that allowed that connection to come back in again, right? And then, if we look at it, these firewalls were heavily network focused, right? Because they're in the data center, and also we're looking at port numbers, we're looking at IP addresses. So essentially, at the OSI level model, they were at the layer 3 and layer 4, right? And these firewalls were hardware centric, right? Hardware centric and in the data center. Right. So then the evolution happened, several years later, that we moved from the traditional firewalls to the next generation firewall, right? And in the next generation firewall, what we were really doing is we were doing more deeper packet inspections, right? We were looking at the application context. We were becoming more aware of the application. So in the traditional firewalls, we knew that we're inspecting web traffic, right? So let's say, for example, port 80. But in the next generation firewalls, we could differentiate, and we're looking at more deeper understanding that, if it's using a specific service of, say, for example, Facebook or another social media platform, right? So it's more complex and integrated analysis happening at the packet level. And also, many vendors typically call it, like, for something like app ID, right? That's the feature that allows to do more granular inspection of the packet, right? Now, also what it did, it can provide sandboxing. So with sandboxing, like, for example, malware inspection, where it can detonate some of the malware, it can do that kind of service. And that kind of brings up onto the next point, which is these firewalls, the next generation, is essentially providing more services than what the traditional firewall was doing, right? So malware inspection, it's looking at threat intelligence, it can do virus checking, it can do a lot more, right? And also it's inspecting more of the OSI layer model, right? So typically we were looking at the layer 3, layer 4 on the traditional firewall. Here with the next generation firewalls, we're doing the same thing, but now we're going all the way up to the application stack, right? And in that respect, because we're doing more stuff at the application, we are doing more of the security services, right? It's offering more security services. And these firewalls kind of like started off in the hardware. So again, it's hardware, it's data center, it's still architecture. But these firewalls also evolved to software as well. And one of the driving factors was the evolution of the cloud computing, right? So many vendors who had these traditional next firewalls that evolved to the next generation firewalls started offering their next gen firewall solutions that existed in a hardware form in a software form for the cloud, right? So you can go to the vendor and say, I want a cloud version of the firewall. You could buy these cloud versions for GCP, Azure, AWS, right? So the next generation firewall in the data center, but now also offered in the cloud space, right? And then what happened a few years later, we evolved from the next generation firewall to the web application firewall. And one of the main driving factors for this was the evolution of the cloud itself, right? So if you look at AWS, GCP, Azure, right there, you can get web application firewalls in those platforms, right? So what are these firewalls, right? So they're predominantly just looking at the layer 7, right, of the OSI model at the application level, right? It's heavily API security kind of like inspection kind of area, right? And also, if someone said to me, what is the WAF, I will simply just respond with, it's basically protecting OS top 10, right? That's what its focus is, right? And also, if you look at it, the WAF firewalls really kind of like, I guess its popularity increased a lot with the evolution of the cloud, right? So when you think of web application firewalls, you think of cloud, But unlike the next generation firewalls and the traditional firewalls where you actually install them and deploy them platonically, right, by themselves, right, and you connect them to upstream and downstream routers and switches, with the web application firewalls, what you typically do is you don't typically deploy it by itself, right? What you do is you deploy it when you're deploying it, for example, an external load balancer device, or you deploy it when you're deploying something like content delivery networks at the edge of your network, like CloudFront or something like that, or Azure Front Door. You can actually position it something like that as well, right? So you're really bolting the WAF onto something else when you deploy it in the cloud, right, to provide you with that application level security, right? And these solutions are really kind of it's flexible. You can deploy in many different locations. An example here is SASE environments, right? So you can deploy WAF components in that SASE, that security service delivered as a service in the cloud, right? So that's another location as well, right? So if you look at it here, this is all software, right? So there's not, underlining, obviously it sits on virtualized hardware, but it is a software component, right? And if you think about it, that's the kind of evolution of where firewalls started from and where it kind of ended up with. But where are we today with firewalls, and where is firewalls moving in the future, right? So let's look at some of the trends here, right? So first of all, the trend that we're seeing is firewall as a service, right? So if you look at it, if you look at SASE models, right, they're offering a security stack. In that security stack, there's a firewall, right? And really, SASE models are providing security as a service, right? They're offering all these securities in a service form. So we're seeing that as well. And we're also seeing like things like, for example, Azure provides a native firewall feature as well, along with other cloud platforms as well. So that's a trend we're seeing as well, firewall as a service. So you don't have to invest in the actual OPEX and CAPEX costs that you did traditionally with the traditional firewalls, the next generation firewalls, right? The other trend that we're seeing is the decoupling aspects of firewalls in general, right? So if we looked at it, the traditional firewalls was layer 3 and layer 4, right? If we look at the WAF, that's layer 7. So really today, we haven't really changed on what we need. We still need firewall security from layer 3 all the way to layer 7, right? We still need it. One would even argue that you need a layer 2 as well, right? The MAC addresses, etc., right? So we still need the security, but sometimes we don't need all of it at that architectural point. So in this instance, I would probably say that if you think about it, what application security groups are and network security groups, right, it's actually providing networks at the network interface the NIC level of a VM, right, or the actual at the network level of the VPC or VNet level, right, and these can be stateful, some doesn't have to be stateful, and there's various permutations between GCP, Azure, and AWS, right? But just remember, what we now have is we have ASGs and application security groups and network security groups in the cloud space that are traditionally doing what we would expect from a traditional firewall, right? Because at some point, you want to have a layered approach to security. So you still have that, and at a different location, you may have a WAF, right? So you're layering that security on, right? So it's the decoupling of some of these security aspects, right? And then also the big thing is artificial intelligence and machine level driven functionality, right? So if you look at, for example, web application firewalls, they have this, right? You have that machine learning AI ability to adapt to security attack vectors and threats and everything else, right? So it's adapting as the security landscape is changing, right? So that's a big trend as well. And you also see security from a logging perspective, right? So you see, SIMs and the ability to do correlation between events, right? That's all machine learning, AI driven, right? So that's a big trend there as well. And also, you also see, think from an architecture perspective, right? So you'll see now firewalls that are deployed in, for example, in the SASE model at the edge of the network, right? You have Microsoft Azure delivering the Azure Firewall as part of its own dedicated VNet from an architecture perspective, right? So really, what you're seeing here is kind of like the evolution of now we're thinking about in terms of the actual architecture aspects of it, right? And really, if you look at the form factor here, right, of these, what I would say, like where we're going to, right? So as we started off with the hardware, then we kind of moved into the software. Where do we move here, right? So I'm just going to leave this with something, for you to think about here. And that is, right, that I feel, right, this is, completely subjective, my own personal view, is that firewalls could, in theory, become serverless, right? I mean, if you think about it, that's the direction that we're moving, right? Things like app functions and the ability to dynamically have event-driven architectures and things like that in the cloud space, right? Why can't firewalls move in that direction as well, right? So that's just to kind of, do kind of like a thought process there. Just something to think about, that there is the potential of having serverless architecture firewalls. And that concludes today's session. Thank you.